Beverly Bain is a professor of women and gender studies in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto. Her work focuses on gender, racism, and policing. Professor Bain, thank you. We're delighted to have you as our first interview voice this morning. Good morning.
Thank you.
You were listening to Kayla's report there as she focused on that young man's story notably. We have heard many similar stories to his this week as we've seen thousands of Canadians gather in cities across this country. What are you seeing in these protests, and what is the message you believe they are delivering?
Well, what we're seeing is that young people of today are saying that they are no longer prepared to live under a system that continues to violate their rights, to violate their humanity, to actually threaten their existence and their lives. And that they have seen this happen time and time again. Let's be clear. While the murder of George Floyd has allowed for this uprising to take place, the killing of Black people, the killing of Black men and Black women, and the brutalizing of Black men and women, and killing of Indigenous people and Black people in this country is not new. It is historic. Black people have been killed in this country for decades by police officers.
So I wonder how frustrating it is for you that we have these discussions only after these crisis moments, and then, of course, interest and focus subsides.
Well, I think it's frustrating for all of us. I mean, the protest is a clear declaration that people have had enough. And then you listen to the provincial premier, Doug Ford, say that Canada does not have systemic deep roots of racism as the U.S., which is a clear whitewashing of Canadian history with its legacy of slavery, settler colonialism, and insidious violence against Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. You also hear François Legault in Quebec say racism does not exist in Quebec. So when we are hearing this against what we are experiencing, what Black and racialized and Indigenous people are experiencing for decades at the hands of police, and we have leaders coming out and saying this, and our Prime Minister taking 21 seconds before he can actually speak to what is happening in the States and here in Canada, speaks volume of how, deeply rooted, the deceitful retelling of Canadian history is in this country, of not acknowledging that racism is a fundamental part of how this system is structured.
That's interesting. I was going to play those very clips for you and get you to respond to them, but you've obviously heard them and have obviously anticipated speaking about them today, because I'm wondering if the message is so clear that the people who are in the streets and gathering have had enough, if those who need to hear that message are indeed getting it.
I'm not sure how. I think there is a clear resistance on the part of the leadership to acknowledge that this is a fundamental problem. And part of that is because they are invested in a particular kind of society, which is that is based on a capitalist, settler colonial society that demands that policing and militarism is at the fundamental core of maintaining this society. I mean, if you have a society where you are defunding public services, you're defunding community services, you're defunding, housing, and you're not creating affordable housing for people. People are being, thrown out of their homes by landlords. Jobs, people are not getting jobs, and the jobs that they get minimum wage, particularly for Black and racialized people. Who's at the front line right now are Black women and racialized people who are at the front line, who are dying from COVID-19, but are also dying at the hands of policing. And since COVID-19, what we have witnessed is the hyper increased surveillance and vigilance of policing. In fact, they've been granted excessive powers under COVID-19, and they have been surveilling, they've been stopping, they have been brutalizing Blacks on the streets.
Is it the word systemic that seems to be so troublesome, that people just don't grasp when it's put before racism?
I think it's a refusal to acknowledge. It's a refusal to acknowledge that that racism exists in this country. This country was founded on racism and on colonialism. This is why particular groups of people are more subject to this kind of violence. And this is why our country continues to fund police as a way to subvert and as a way to control and as a way to violate the rights of those of us who would dare rise up and say enough is enough, which is why it is important to defund the police.
And we just had a report on that. It's certainly a discussion that more and more people are having at this time, redirecting resources into other programs, into the community. How would you see that?
Exactly.
How would you like to see, when you, just so people understand, defund police, reduce the number of armed officers and put money elsewhere to greater effect? What would it improve in your view?
Well, it would certainly putting that money back into the communities to make them sustainable so that those communities can decide how that money gets used. If the money that has gone in, I mean, we have a Toronto police force of $1 billion budget, when in fact that money could go into communities that are actually, where there's poor housing, where there is unemployment, where there is, various kinds of services that have been taken away from these communities around recreation, around various kinds of support for these communities. I mean, that money needs to go back into the community so they can decide how that gets used to support those communities, to make them healthier communities.
Okay. I certainly think that's going to be part of the future and the discussion as people look seriously at reform yet again. I want to ask you, you wrote a book back in 2010. It's on a different issue, I want to be clear. But the title of the book caught my ear, it caught my eye, Unconscious Conceptual Practice, Bringing into Lived Consciousness feminist activities on the Toronto Police Service's sexual assault audits. It was on that issue. But it's that phrase, bringing into lived consciousness, that struck me. How do we do that as a society with racism?
Well, first and foremost, it was an article that I did, and what it came out of the work that I did at the the audit, based on the audit of the Jane Doe audit, the police services audit into the investigation of sexual assault of women in Toronto. And what I was actually pinpointing there is that it is critical for us to recognize that those of us who are experiencing and living on a day-to-day basis with this violence, with the violence with police violence, with the violence the everyday violence, economic, social, political, that we do have that lived experience. We do understand that. We do experience that on a day-to-day basis. That is in itself data. That is in itself information that can determine what comes next. And in fact, we should be paying more attention to the lived realities of women, Black women, Indigenous women in this city who are saying this is happening. We don't need experts, written documents and otherwise to tell us. We are saying this is happening. That's the lived consciousness. And it means other people, meaning the state, white people, white establishment, acknowledging, accepting that, and accepting that this society needs to change fundamentally. That first and foremost, our leaders need to acknowledge that this is a racist, settler colonial society, and that it impacts the lives of Black women, Black men, Indigenous women and men, and those who are most marginalized. And until our leaders come to terms with that, and other people come to terms with that, we will continue to be always having to repeat ourselves. And also, of course, as you can tell, we're tired of talking. So, we are determined to see change.
Professor Bain, I appreciate so much our discussion this morning. Thank you. Beverly Bain, a professor of women and gender studies at the University of Toronto, and she is in Toronto this morning. Thank you again, Professor.